24 years justice has finally been served.
Paul Ezra Rhoades was executed today.
Have you ever wondered what goes through a killer's mind on the very last day of their life? Is it fear, regret, or something else entirely? Something darker? On November 18, 2011, Paul Ezra Rhoades faced the final hours of a life defined by violence and pain. A man convicted of multiple brutal murders across Idaho, Rhoades had spent more than 20 years on death row. Now, with no chance left to escape, he was trapped in a cold, lonely cell, counting down the moments until his execution. But there was one unexpected visitor that morning, someone who would change everything. And little did Rhoades know, by midnight, a desperate legal battle would take a shocking turn, throwing his fate into question once more. This is the story of Paul Ezra Rhoades' final 24 hours. Before any legal battles, before the headlines and the courtrooms, Paul Ezra Rhoades lived a very different life. Born on January 18, 1957 in Idaho Falls, Idaho, Paul was the first of 4 children. But from a young age, his world was filled with hardship. At just 4 years old, he was struck by polio, a disease that left him weak and often confined to hospitals. At home, life was no refuge. His parents, Augustus and Teresa, argued constantly, creating an atmosphere heavy with tension and pain. By the time Paul was 10, he had already begun drinking. School no longer held his interest, and soon he dropped out. With no steady path, he turned to drugs. Methamphetamines would become a grip he never quite escaped. To provide for himself and his family, Paul took on odd jobs, traveling through Idaho and nearby states, working mostly with sheetrock. But underneath the surface, trouble was brewing. He began breaking into homes, stealing whatever he could find. Then, on the morning of March 1, 1987, the body of 21-year-old Stacy Dawn Baldwin was found at an archery range about 5 miles northwest of Blackfoot. Stacy worked the night shift at the Red Mini Barn, a small local store. She had been shot 3 times. Investigators quickly connected her murder to a robbery that had spiraled violently out of control the night before. Just over 2 weeks later, tragedy struck again. 20-year-old Nolan Haddon, a convenience store clerk in Idaho Falls, was discovered critically injured inside the store's walk-in cooler. Despite being rushed to the hospital, Nolan succumbed to his wounds within hours. Only 4 days after Nolan's death, the body of 34-year-old Susan Mickelbacher was found in a remote lava field west of Idaho Falls. Susan, a special education teacher, had been abducted from a supermarket parking lot 2 days earlier after dropping off lesson plans at school. During her captivity, she was forced to cash $2,000 checks at separate banks. Her body showed horrifying signs of violence. She had been shot 9 times and sexually assaulted, possibly after death. But the darkness that had begun to take hold in Idaho was far from over. As the bodies piled up, the law was closing in, and Paul Ezra Rhoades found himself on a path he could not escape. Before long, the crimes that had shocked entire communities would catch up with him in a way no one saw coming. On the morning of March 27, 1987, Paul Ezra Rhoades was arrested in Wells, Nevada. It began with a warrant for grand larceny, a relatively minor charge compared to what was to come. But as officers took him into custody, they found something that would change everything: a handgun hidden among his belongings. That handgun proved to be the key that unlocked a terrifying truth. Ballistics tests showed that the bullets from Paul's gun matched those used in the recent murders of Stacy Baldwin, Nolan Haddon, and Susan Mickelbacher. Suddenly, the man who had slipped quietly through odd jobs and petty theft was facing the full weight of the law. Authorities charged him not just with murder, but with kidnapping, robbery, rape, desecration of a corpse, and multiple firearm violations. The first trial began on January 18, 1988, on his birthday. His defense team tried to argue insanity, but the Idaho Supreme Court rejected the plea before the trial even started. Among potential jurors was then-Governor Cecil Andrus, though he was later excused for having prior involvement in the case. Despite these controversies, the jury needed less than 5 hours to find Paul guilty on all charges. Sentencing was scheduled for March 16th, but this was only the beginning. Next came the trial for Stacey Baldwin's murder in early March. Paul's lawyers argued that evidence against him was circumstantial and pushed a strong alibi that he was babysitting his sister's children when the crime happened. Even a watch allegedly stolen from Baldwin and found in Paul's possession was explained away as a Christmas gift from his mother. But the prosecution highlighted other proof, an unusual shoe print matching Paul's large feet and the same deadly bullets from his handgun. Again, the jury returned a guilty verdict and a death sentence followed. For Nolan Haddon's murder, Paul pleaded guilty to avoid another drawn-out trial, but maintained his innocence. This plea brought 2 life sentences. Despite numerous appeals and motions for retrials, Rhoades' convictions and death sentences were upheld. On October 19, 2011, the Idaho Supreme Court issued a death warrant, scheduling his execution for November 18, 2011. A date marked not just on a calendar, but on the minds of everyone involved, the families, the community, and Paul himself. What went through his mind as that day approached? Was he defiant, broken, or somewhere in between? Could he still find hope? Or was he consumed by regret? No one could know for sure. But one thing was clear, those final hours would be filled with questions, memories, and the chilling reality of a life about to end. And now we step inside the last 24 hours of Paul Ezra Rhoades' life. It was 6 o'clock in the morning on November 17, 2011, just 24 hours before Paul Ezra Rhoades was scheduled to be executed by lethal injection. Outside the Idaho Maximum Security Institution, the sky was still dark, the air was cold. Inside the prison, the overhead lights flickered on, bathing the death row unit in a sterile glow. That's when Rhoades opened his eyes. He knew. Today wasn't just another day behind bars. It was the beginning of his end. Correctional officers had already begun their standard routine. But this morning was anything but routine. Word had quietly spread through the facility. Inmates kept their eyes down. Even the guards moved a little slower. Rhoades was awake, alert. He didn't ask for a priest. He didn't speak much. He just stared ahead, lost in thought, silent. By 8 o'clock, a tray was quietly slid through the slot. Scrambled eggs, 2 slices of toast, a small container of jelly, coffee, lukewarm, the same breakfast served every day. But this wasn't just any day. Paul Ezra Rhoades sat on the edge of his cot, staring at the food for a long moment. He picked up the fork, but barely touched the eggs. He spread a little jelly on the toast, but left most of it uneaten. The coffee went cold in his hands. He chewed slowly, mechanically. No one said anything. The guards outside didn't speak. The air around him felt thick, as if even time had paused to watch him. This was his last full breakfast as a living man, and yet he seemed elsewhere, lost in a fog of memory, dread, and resignation. The tray was removed just after 8:30. Most of the food was left untouched. Paul Ezra Rhoades sat motionless for nearly 30 minutes, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped tightly together. He wasn't praying, at least not in the traditional sense, just staring at the floor, like he was trying to make sense of everything that had brought him here. Outside his cell, there was quiet movement, footsteps, keys, whispered orders. The prison staff had begun the 24-hour death watch protocol. Every movement was documented, every visitor logged. At 9:30, his spiritual advisor was permitted in. The chaplain sat opposite Paul, speaking in a calm, low voice. The details of that conversation remain private, but witnesses would later say Rhoades hardly spoke. He only nodded a few times. Once his lips moved as if to ask something, then stopped short. He wasn't crying, he wasn't angry, but he wasn't calm either. There was a tremor in his fingers, a small involuntary twitch in his cheek. Outside the door, guards stood silently. No one relaxed. By 10:15, the chaplain was escorted out. The door locked again with a heavy click that echoed down the corridor. Paul sat alone again. At 10:30, his attorney arrived. This wasn't a legal strategy meeting, it was goodbye. But behind the quiet words and handshakes, something hung in the air, a final flicker of hope. Just hours earlier, the defense team had filed an 11th-hour petition to the United States Supreme Court. They argued that Idaho's lethal injection protocols might violate the Eighth Amendment, specifically the ban on cruel and unusual punishment. Paul knew about the appeal, but he also knew the odds. The lawyer gently broke the news. The court had denied the stay. The execution would proceed. There was no visible reaction, no burst of emotion, just a slight nod. A long pause followed. Then Paul asked about his mother. Yes, she was coming. And yes, she had said she forgave him. Paul looked away. By 11:15, the visit was over. The attorney shook his hand firmly for the last time and left. Paul returned to his cell, sat again, didn't lie down, didn't read, just sat, waiting. By 12 p.m., noon, the cell block remained hushed. The next phase of the day was approaching, and with each passing hour, the gravity of what was coming crept closer, slowly, quietly, inevitably. Soon after, lunch was served. A modest tray, meatloaf, mashed potatoes, peas. Paul barely touched it. He sat for a long while, staring at the food, moving the peas around like clock hands he could no longer turn back. Outside the walls, time moved with indifference. Inside, it had begun to collapse, shrinking hour by hour. He was quiet, withdrawn. Occasionally, he'd mutter under his breath. No one knew if he was praying or simply counting the minutes. Around 1:30 p.m., a door opened in the visitation wing. His mother, Teresa Rhoades, walked in. She was older now. The pain was etched into her face, a permanent crease. She held her purse tightly in both hands, as though she could somehow squeeze strength from it. Paul stood up slowly. The guards gave them space, but not privacy. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. This was the woman who had raised him through illness and hospital stays, who had argued with his father behind closed doors, who had once bought him a watch for Christmas, the very one that prosecutors said tied him to murder. She sat down across from him, and then she cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, as if the grief had been waiting years for permission to come out. Paul didn't cry. He whispered something about being sorry. She reached for his hand through the glass divider. They talked for just under 30 minutes. About his siblings, about her health, about how she forgave him, even if she couldn't understand everything he'd done. When the time was up, she pressed her palm against the glass. Paul mirrored it. That was the last time she would see her son alive. Around 3 p.m., he was escorted back to his cell. No shackles this time. There was no reason. Back in the quiet of his death row unit. As the day's light dimmed outside the prison walls, Paul Ezra Rhoades remained quiet but alert. Guards approached him with a routine, the final physical examination. Doctors and nurses entered the small room, their faces professional but somber. They carefully checked his pulse, blood pressure, and reflexes, making sure his body was strong enough to endure the grim journey ahead. Every measurement, every test was a reminder that this was no ordinary night. Though his body was tense, his eyes revealed a man wrestling with the reality closing in fast. No words were spoken about the outcome. It was understood. He was fit. After some time, it was the time for Paul's final meal, a small, simple selection of comfort foods that held no real warmth or joy. He stared at the tray before him, hot dogs, baked beans, and strawberry ice cream. The food sat there like a silent witness to the hours he had left. He picked at the hot dog, taking only a few bites. The baked beans were left untouched. The ice cream melted slowly in the heat of the room. Untouched. His appetite was gone, replaced by a hollow quiet that echoed louder than words. This meal was not about taste or hunger. It was a final act, a ritual before the end. Time slowed. Each tick of the clock was a countdown he could not escape. The hour came when the prison moved into the final phase. Lights dimmed even further. The hallways emptied. The air thickened with anticipation and dread. Paul lay back, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. The quiet stretched around him, broken only by the distant sounds of the prison night. The final journey was hours away, but the weight of it was already crushing. The stillness was broken briefly as guards moved quietly to confirm the final preparations. Every detail was checked, every step rehearsed. The grim machinery of the execution was in motion beyond the steel doors. The chamber was ready. Paul's breathing remained steady but shallow. Prison officials described him as anxious and lucid, a man fully aware of his fate, yet strangely calm in the face of death. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, there was a sudden surge of legal activity. Rhoades' lawyers submitted a last-minute appeal in an attempt to delay the execution. The prison held its breath. The motion was reviewed swiftly, but the court denied the stay. The execution, originally scheduled for 8 o'clock, was pushed back slightly to 9:05. Hearing this, guards moved with slow precision, preparing the final logistics. Paul was kept under close watch, the tension thick but silent. At 8:30 in the morning on November 18th, Paul Ezra Rhoades was carefully escorted from his cell to the execution chamber at the Idaho Maximum Security Institution. Flanked by correctional officers, his steps echoed quietly down the cold, sterile corridor. The gravity of the moment was palpable. This was the final journey for a man who had spent years awaiting the inevitable. The chamber was prepared meticulously, a stark room with harsh fluorescent lighting and the imposing execution gurney at its center. Inside, a small group had gathered to witness the event. Representatives of all 3 victims' families were present, along with Rhoades' mother, Pauline Rhoades. The room also included prison officials responsible for overseeing the process and 4 members of the Idaho media who had been allowed to attend despite some restrictions on what they could see. The mood was tense, a quiet storm of sorrow, anger, and anticipation. Once inside, Rhoades was guided onto the gurney and firmly strapped in. His arms and legs were secured with heavy restraints, immobilizing him for the procedure to come. Medical staff moved with practiced precision to insert intravenous lines into his veins, the last physical barrier between life and death. The doctors and nurses carefully monitored his health, ensuring he was physically fit to endure the execution, a grim necessity for the state's new lethal injection protocol. Throughout this process, Rhoades appeared anxious but lucid, his eyes darting about the room, occasionally resting on his mother's tear-streaked face. At 8:55, the warden read aloud the death warrant, formally initiating the final phase of this grim journey. Lying on his back, strapped to the cold metal table, Rhoades tapped his fingers nervously, betraying the tension that ran beneath his calm exterior. Then, precisely at 9 o'clock, the execution began. The first of 3 drugs was administered into his veins, designed to sedate, paralyze, and ultimately stop his heart. In the solemn silence that followed, Rhoades spoke his final words with surprising clarity and volume. He apologized directly to Bert Michelbacher, the husband of one of his victims. "I'm sorry for the part I played in your wife's death," he said. But when it came to the other 2 murders, he refused to accept responsibility. "For Haddon and for Baldwin, you still have to keep looking. I can't help you," he told the families, his voice steady but somber. His words prompted an immediate response. Baldwin's brother whispered bitterly. He lied the whole way through, whilst Nolan Haddon's mother, Julie, quietly muttered, "What a coward." As Rhoades finished addressing the victims' families, he slowly turned toward the section of the chamber where his own representatives were seated. With a clear, steady voice, he said softly, "Mom, goodbye." His mother wiped away tears as she listened to her son's final words. Then, turning to face Warden Randy Blades, he offered an unexpected message of forgiveness. "You guys, I forgive you. I really do." Those simple words marked the end of his statement, a final gesture of peace amid the intense weight of the moment. It was a brief, poignant farewell that contrasted with the harsh reality of what was about to follow. The minutes dragged on as the drugs coursed through his body. It took 22 minutes from the initial injection for Rhoades to be declared dead at 9:15. The witnesses in the chamber sat silently, some with tears, others with faces set in grim determination. Outside the prison walls, the day was marked by protests on both sides of the death penalty debate. About 50 activists braved cold winds and held silent vigils, questioning the morality of capital punishment, while a small group of supporters gathered nearby, affirming their belief in justice served. Afterward, Brian Edgerton, a longtime family friend of the Michelbachers, who had helped search for Susan Michelbacher after she was reported missing, reflected on the moment. Though the pain of loss remained raw, he said the execution brought a sense of closure. "It's amazing how much is still there after all this time," he said. "A psychologist said there's always going to be a gnawing pain. It never completely heals. This helps a lot to move on and do the best we can to go forward." For the families of the victims, Rhoades' death marked the end of a painful chapter, though the scars of his brutal crimes remained. Though justice was served, the echoes of his crimes linger in the lives of those who lost loved ones. As we reflect on his story, we are reminded of the profound impact one life can have, both in darkness and in the pursuit of closure.
He was found guilty for his crimes, and this morning the state put to death Paul Ezra Rhoades.
What do you think? Was justice served? We'd love to hear from you. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on future investigations into cases that have shaped history and still leave us questioning. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Stay curious and keep seeking the truth. Stay safe, stay curious, and we'll see you in the next video.